The grand strategy for the 1796 campaign against Austria was the brainchild of Lazare Carnot, though he drew heavily on the thinking of others, Napoleon not least, including Kellermann's 20,000-strong army of the Alps and a reserve of 5,000 stationed in Provence, and the Var. France could put 240,000 men into the field. The French offensive was three-pronged. 70,000 troops, then in the lower Rhine under Jourdan's command, would strike along the main valley, invest the fortress of Mainz and then advance into Franconia. Another 70,000 under Moreau would advance into Swabia and the Danube Valley, and the third, under Napoleon, would engage the Austrians in the Po Valley. The Italian campaign was designed as a sideshow, but if it proved unexpectedly successful, there was provision in Carnot's plan for an advance up the Adige Valley to Trent and the Tyrol, there to link with Moreau for the coup de grace. 2 days after his wedding, Napoleon left Paris with Junot and arrived in Marseille on the night of the 21st of March. Along the road they had discussed Carnot's threefold intention in the great campaign against Austria: to divert growing unrest at home with a foreign adventure, to consolidate the revolution and export its principles, and, most importantly, to stop the drain on the French treasury by getting the nation's armies to live off the soil, or by plunder, and thus in effect exporting France's military expenses. Napoleon has often been censured for turning the Italian campaign into a gigantic quest for booty, but this possibility was already implicit in the Directory's grand strategy. At Marseille he visited his mother. She told him that the 16-year-old beauty, Napoleon Bonaparte, was now beyond parental control and had a magnetic effect on men. Napoleon's idea of using Stanislas Freron as his agent to tidy up loose ends in the south, principally the Desiree business, had backfired disastrously. Freron, a notorious rake with syphilis, had been smitten with the luscious pollen, and she with him. If Napoleon had not already known of the 40-year-old's unsavory past, Josephine would have enlightened enough that the man was unreliable. He was a former Robespierre acolyte who had trimmed successfully to emerge from Thermidor as a Barras protégé. But it was intolerable that he might infect Pauline with venereal disease, and that she could end up married to the most promiscuous man in Paris. Just at the moment Napoleon lacked the power to cross Barras over Freron, so he advised Letizia to stall and await further instructions. On the 24th of March he was at Toulon, where he met and greatly impressed Denis de Creze, later to be his Minister of Marine. Next day he was at Antibes, where he conferred with Louis Berthier, his 43-year-old chief of staff. Berthier, a veteran of the American War of Independence and the Vendée, was a man of great energy and lucid mind. He was a brilliant organizer and a master of the terse dispatch. Napoleon sensed his quality straight away. Never one to judge men, at least, by external appearances, he ignored Berthier's physical ugliness, his gaucherie, his stammering and his compulsive nail-biting, and concentrated on his great administrative talents, enhanced, in Napoleon's eyes, by Berthier's lack of ambition for a field command. Yet the supreme test of Napoleon's ability to overawe rivals and bend them to his will came in Nice on the 27th of March, when he met his three principal generals, Serrurier, Augereau and Massena. Serrurier was a tall man with a scar on his lip, a 53-year-old martinet who had fought in the 7 Years' War and in Corsica in I-770. Although he was the son of a molecatre at the royal stud at Laon, he had the demeanor of an aristocrat, and it was said that, after the revolution, he went in danger of his life every time he entered a new army camp. Such was his foppish, oligarchic air. He had less energy than Berthier or Augereau, but was a man of greater integrity. The 38-year-old Augereau, who had begun life in the Parisian gutters, was the son of a stonemason and had had a checkered career. A devotee of the first real communist, Gracchus Babeuf, who was in this very year executed by the Directory, Augereau was a genuine man of mystery. He had deserted from the French army at 17, and then led an itinerant life as an adventurer. According to his own account, he had at various times sold watches in Constantinople, given dancing lessons, served in the Russian army and eloped with a Greek girl to Lisbon. The French Revolution was the making of him. He commanded the German Legion in the Vendée and then won a spectacular victory against the Spanish with the Army of the Pyrenees in 1795. A man of little education and indifferent intellect, Augereau was a great fighting general, with a tendency to melancholia, as he would brood depressively the evening after a battle, regardless of whether he had won or lost. Popular with his troops, tall, talkative, foul-mouthed, with a great hooked nose, Augereau was memorably described by Desaix as follows: fine, big man, handsome face, big nose, has served in many countries, a soldier with few equals, always bragging. André Massena, age 38, was the greatest general of the three and would prove to have military talents of a high order. Dark, thin and taciturn, a dedicated hedonist and womanizer, Massena started life as a cabin boy and had been a non-commissioned officer and smuggler. He looked like an eagle and was said to have an eagle's eye for terrain. But the quality Napoleon most prized in him was his indefatigable energy. Dauntless, stubborn, imperturbable, he seemed to spend all his days and nights on horseback. Nothing ever made him feel discouraged if he was defeated heavily. He went jauntily to work next day as if he was the victor. Serrier, Augereau and Messina were tough characters in anyone's book, and most 26-year-olds would have quailed at the prospect of asserting superiority over them. Additionally, they were disposed to be contemptuous of the newcomer, thinking him merely one of Barras's favorites and a boy general. Messina and Augereau both thought they should have had the command themselves and poured scorn on Napoleon's ideas for the Italian campaign. Messina said that only a professional intriguer could have come up with such a plan, while the blunt-speaking Augereau used the epithet imbecile. By the end of the meeting, Napoleon had won all 3 men round. Legend has perverted the reality of what took place and credited Bonaparte with Svengali-like powers, but it is certain that the trio of generals thenceforth looked on him with new respect. Messina remarked that when Napoleon put on his general's hat he seemed to have grown 2 feet, while Augereau allegedly remarked, "That little bugger really frightened me." What is certain is that Napoleon tried to calm their minds over the drawbacks in Carnot's strategy. It did not take outstanding insight to see that the 3 main French armies were operating too far away from each other and that, if any of the offensives flagged, the Austrians would simply transfer troops from one front to another. The Directory had not appointed a supreme commander to coordinate the movements of all 3 armies, assuming, absurdly, that Jourdan, Moreau and Bonaparte would all cooperate willingly and without rivalry, and had compounded their error by seeming to assume that the Alps, which lay between the Army of Italy and the other 2, was simply a paper obstacle. At his headquarters, Napoleon found 37,000 ill-fed, unpaid and demoralized troops, with which he was supposed to clear 52,000 Austrians out of half a dozen mountain passes between Nice and Genoa. He was fortunate to have at his side his old Corsican friend Salisti, who raised alone in Genoa to see to the army's most pressing supply problems. Even so, Napoleon reported to the Directory on the 28th of March, "One battalion has mutinied on the ground that it had neither boots nor pay," and a week later wrote again, "The army is in frightening penury. Misery has led to indiscipline, and without discipline there can be no victory." The famous proclamation Napoleon is said to have made to his troops at this time is apocryphal. It was written in St. Helena and represents the Aristotelian spirit of what might have been said, and even what ought to have been said. It also shows Napoleon as a master of propaganda and already sedulously at work on his own legend. "Soldiers, you are naked, ill-fed, though the government owes you much, it can give you nothing. Your patience, the courage you have shown amidst these rocks, are admirable, but they procure you no glory, no fame shines upon you. I want to lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will lie in your power, you will find their honor, glory and riches. Soldiers of the army of Italy, will you lack courage or steadfastness?" Napoleon saw at once that his best chance of breaking into Italy was by separating the Austrians from their allies the Piedmontese. His intelligence sources told him there was bad blood between the 2 commanders. The allies were scattered in 3 different locations, and the Austrian commander, Beaulieu, thought the main French blow would fall on the Riviera coast. Napoleon therefore decided to engage the Austrian right in the mountains, and take out the war-weary Piedmontese, ensuring himself local superiority in numbers at all times. On the 12th of April he won his first victory, at Montenat, employing Messina adroitly and using a combination of clouds of skirmishers with charges from battalion columns, which inflicted 3,000 casualties on the enemy. Further successful actions followed at Millesimo against the Sards and Dago against the Austrians. Having split the allies, Napoleon then turned to deal with the Piedmontese, and broke them in the 3 battles of San Michele, Seva and Mondovi. On the 23rd of April Colli, the Piedmontese commander, requested an armistice. Within 10 days Napoleon was in control of the key mountain passes, and had destroyed a superior enemy force piecemeal by rapidity of movement. Although Hannibal merely crossed the Alps, we turned their flanks is probably another St. Helena accretion. There can be no doubting Napoleon's genuine euphoria at the time. To the Directory he sent back glowing letters with Joseph, who had been acting as his unofficial aide. After the armistice of Cherasco on the 28th of April gave him control of the mountain fortresses and the lines of communication into Lombardy, he wrote, "Tomorrow I shall march against Beaulieu, force him to cross the Po, cross myself immediately after and seize the whole of Lombardy. Within a month I hope to be on the mountains of the Tyrol, in touch with the army of the Rhine, and to carry the war in concert into Bavaria." To his soldiers, ever mindful of propaganda advantages, he made a proclamation, which exaggerated his achievements in typical manner. "Soldiers, in 15 days you have gained 6 victories, taken 21 colors and 55 pieces of artillery, seized several fortresses and conquered the richest parts of Piedmont. You have taken 5,000 prisoners and killed and wounded more than 10,000. At this stage realism and propaganda still vied for supremacy. On the 24th of April he wrote to the Directory, "The hungry soldiers are committing excesses that make one blush to be human. The capture of Seva and Mondovi may give us the means to put this right, and I am going to make some terrible examples. I will restore order or I will give up the command of these brigands." Yet to Barras personally he wrote on the previous day a sycophantic letter boasting about the 6 battles He had already won, and the 21 captured enemy standards Joseph was bringing back to Paris. Napoleon's next task was to prevent the Austrians withdrawing to the comparative safety of the far bank of the Po. The French armies debouched from the mountains and entered the plains of Lombardy. The Austrians dug in and waited for them on the left bank of the Po near Pavia. Again employing the war of rapid movement, he took Serrières and Messina on a 60-mile route march, which ended with their divisions making a classic river crossing at Piacenza in sight of the enemy. The hero of the hour, who crossed with 900 men and established a bridgehead on the far bank, was Jean Lannes, a dashing 26-year-old colonel whom Napoleon had first noticed at Dago. Napoleon now advanced on Milan, outflanking Beaulieu's main army. Barring the route to Milan was a 12,000-strong Austrian army at Lodi, on the river Adda. Trying to ford the swiftly flowing river would be costly, so Napoleon opted for an assault on the bridge at by the Austrians. The bridge, 2 yards long and 12 feet wide, forced attacking troops into a bottlenecked killing ground, and Napoleon's generals advised him that to attack artillery along such a narrow front was suicide. But Napoleon was determined to take the bridge by storm. First, he worked on the feelings of his 4,000 assault troops, alternately cajoling them and telling them that they lacked the courage for the planned enterprise. Then he sent his cavalry on a wide sweep in search of a ford. They were to cross and fall on the Austrians from the rear. At 6 p.m. on Rome, Napoleon released his assault force of Frenchmen and Savoyards onto the bridge. Predictably, they took terrible casualties from the massed Austrian guns. Seeing their men falter, Lannes and Messina led an elite squad of grenadiers on another attack across the bridge. 50 yards from the other side, they dived into the river to avoid point-blank fire. In response, the Austrians unleashed their cavalry, which drove the elite squad back into the water. Just when all appeared lost, the devious circling French cavalry, which had taken an unconscionable time to find a suitable ford, swept in on the Austrian flank. Once it had silenced the big guns, Napoleon's troops streamed across the long line of planks. As dusk fell, the Austrians broke and ran, leaving behind all 16 guns, 335 casualties and 700 prisoners. But the French had paid dearly for the victory and left 200 dead on the bridge and in the Enver. Even though he had not been able to vanquish Beaulieu decisively, a fact disguised and obfuscated by Bonapartist mystique and triumphalism, Lodi was a psychological breakthrough for Napoleon. To have pulled off such a feat of arms gave him confidence in his star. He wrote later, "It was only on the evening of Lodi that I believed myself a superior man, and that the ambition came to me of executing the great things which had so far been occupying my thoughts only as a fantastic dream. After Lodi I no longer saw myself as a mere general, but as a man called upon to influence the destiny of a people. The idea occurred to me that I could well become a decisive actor on our political scene." His troops too believed, after 7 clear victories, that they were led by an ever-victorious general. It was now that the nickname of the Little Corporal was first bestowed. Apparently one of his units decided to see how long he would take to become a real general, starting from the ranks and getting a promotion after each victory. But the later image of Napoleon leading the first wave of attackers over the bridge is the stuff of legend. Napoleon did not lack personal courage, but on this occasion he was supervising his artillery. Napoleon entered Milan in triumph on the 15th of May. Marmont remembered him saying, "Well, Marmont, what do you think they'll say in Paris? Will this be enough for them? They've seen nothing yet. In our time nobody has had a grander conception than mine, and it's my example that must point the way." But what the Directory said in Paris, albeit in private, was that Napoleon, after 7 victories, had grown too powerful. They informed him that the Italian command would be split. Kellerman would command in Lombardy while he was to march south to secure Genoa, Leghorn, Rome and Naples. Napoleon replied with a thinly veiled threat of resignation, employing some masterly irony, "Kellerman will command the army as well as I, for no one is more convinced than I am that the victories are due to the courage and audacity of the men, but I believe that to unite Kellerman and myself in Italy is to lose all. I cannot serve willingly with a man who believes himself to be the first general in Europe, and, besides, I believe that one bad general is better than 2 good ones. War, like government, is a matter of tact." The Directory backed down and informed him there was no longer any question of dividing the command. But, they added, he should not think of moving north into the Tyrol in the foreseeable future. First he had to put the Pope in his place. He had to cause the tiara of the self-styled head of the Universal Church to totter. The week Napoleon spent in Milan was notable for the Janus face he displayed. On the one hand, he held himself out as an apostle of Italian unification. On the other, he presided over the most barefaced and systematic looting scene in Lombardy since the 16th century. He began by replacing the old aristocratic government with a new regime of bourgeois liberals. The Dukes of Parma and Modena immediately sued for peace, which Napoleon granted on payment of a hefty tax. On the 17th of May, influenced by the enthusiastic reception he had received in Milan, he wrote to the Directory to urge the creation of a northern Italian republic, and followed this with a declaration to the people of Milan that he would give them liberty. In later utterances, Napoleon argued that Italy had to go through the crucible of war before becoming a united nation, as those skillful founders, who have to transform several guns of small caliber into 148-pounder, first throw them into the furnace, in order to decompose them, and to reduce them to a state of fusion. So the small states had been united to Austria or France in order to reduce them to an elementary state, to get rid of their recollections and pretensions, that they might be prepared for the moment of casting. Yet this apparent idealism was belied by Napoleon's ruthless financial exactions and expropriations. The terrible shape of things to come was evident even before the French army debouched from the mountains onto the Lombardy plain. At Mondovì, Bonaparte commandeered 8,000 rations of fresh meat and 4,000 bottles of wine, and in Acqui he requisitioned all the boots in town at a knockdown price. But it was in Milan that his army really cut loose. An orgy of looting took place, with French generals sending houseloads of art treasures back to Paris in wagons. Napoleon's apologists claim that he was merely carrying out the wishes of a corrupt and venal Directory, but this is not the picture that emerges from his correspondence. On the 9th of May, before Lodi, Napoleon wrote to the Directory as follows: "I repeat my request for a few reputable artists to take charge of choosing and transporting all the beautiful things we shall see fit to send to Paris." In Milan, Napoleon soon lost his initial popularity when he levied 2 million livres in hard cash to pay off the accumulated back pay of the army. His prestige with the rank and file shot up, since this was the first time since I-793 that the army had been paid in cash. Usually, the perennial arrears of pay were made good in useless assignats. All this might have been justified as living off the land, but Napoleon went further by extracting a surplus for the Directory's coffers from Milan, Parma, Modena and the other cities of the Lombardy plain. On the 22nd of May he informed the Directorate that 8 million francs in gold and silver awaited their disposal in Genoa, and by July the tally of funds mulcted for the Directory amounted to 60 million francs. One obvious result was a change in the balance of power. Napoleon now had the whip hand and, if the Directory wanted to survive, its 5 members had to keep on the right side of their most successful general. The political commissars, even in their new diluted manifestation as commissaires aux armies, were a busted flush, and would be suppressed altogether by the end of R7G6. If Napoleon the public figure was now almost in the position of a victorious legionary commander whose exploits terrified the emperor at Rome, the private man was suffering grievously. For R27 days, from the 8th of March until his reunion with her on R3 July, he wrote to Josephine at least once a day. The letters were fervent, poignant, despairing, tender, melancholy, sometimes even prolix and incoherent, full of sexual longing and frustration. On the 30th of March, before any of his great military successes, he wrote, "In the middle of all my business and at the head of my troops, I think of nothing but my adorable Josephine who is alone in my heart." On the 23rd of April, after his 10-day lightning campaign, he wrote, "Come quickly. You are going to come, aren't you? You're going to be here, beside me, in my heart, in my arms, kissing my heart." Another letter from the same period shows clearly the source of his anxiety. Josephine did not write to him, and it was clear that she had no intention of joining him. This evening if I do not get a letter from you, I shall be desperate. Think of me, or tell me with contempt that you do not love me, and then perhaps I shall find some peace of mind." To get Josephine to come down to Italy and find out what was detaining her, Napoleon sent back 3 important envoys. First was Joseph, dispatched on the 24th of April with letters for the Directory, and with a letter of introduction for Josephine. Joseph and his female namesake met but did not get on. The elder Bonaparte was no more impressed by the fading Creole than Lucien had been. Then on the 25th of April Napoleon sent the faithful Junot to Paris with captured standards, instructing him to take the longer route to Paris via the Riviera. He bore an explicit command to Josephine to join her husband. Finally, on the 26th of April he sent Murat via Piedmont, and the Mont-Cenis with letters for Carnot and Barras and a detailed itinerary for Josephine to follow on her travels south. Both men reached Paris on the 6th of May, but Murat was first at the Rue Chantereine. Napoleon's letter proved to be one of his wilder screeds: "A kiss on your lips and on your heart. There's no one else, no one but me, is there? And another on your breast. Lucky Murat. Little hand." A few hours later Junot arrived, with another besotted message: "You must return with Junot. Do you hear, my adorable one? He will see you, he will breathe the air of your shrine. Perhaps you will even allow him the unique favor of a kiss on your cheek, a kiss on your heart, and then another a little lower, much lower. The last two words had been so emphatically underlined that the pen sliced through the paper. Josephine had no intention of going to Italy. Soon after Napoleon left, she took a new lover named Hippolyte Charles, a lieutenant of hussars but only 5'2" tall. Charles was a noted gambler, rake and man about town, part of a hard-drinking, loose-living army set. From Josephine's point of view, he had two valuable assets. He could make her laugh, as Napoleon never could, and he was an accomplished lover who took his time and was able to bring her to climax. Josephine bluntly told Junot she could not leave Paris, so he remained in Paris awaiting further orders. Her way with Murat was more subtle. Sensing that he was attracted to her, she invited him to a champagne breakfast, then spent the day with him on the Champs-Élysées, lunching and dining. Murat later boasted he had bedded her and provided many circumstantial details in the officers' mess. Joseph Hippolyte Charles, but since she was to all intents and purposes a nymphomaniac, Murat's version is not inherently implausible. At all events, she prevailed on Murat sufficiently that he sent a letter to Napoleon, saying she could not travel as she was pregnant. Murat was never wholly trusted by Napoleon once he learned the truth of this unsavory episode. Meanwhile, the ardent letters from Napoleon flooded in. Most of the time, Josephine did not even bother to open them. As far as she was concerned, she enjoyed the social advantages of being General Bonaparte's wife. But, in her own mind at least, the liaison was a pure marriage of convenience. Lovers of dramatic irony may relish the following letter, which arrived while the affair with Charles was at its height. You know very well I could never bear your taking a lover, much less seriously suggest one to you. 1,000 kisses upon your eyes, your lips, your tongue, your cunt. Josephine took the correspondence as an elaborate charade. The playwright Antoine Arnault remembered her reading from one of Napoleon's letters, which was full of jealous suspicion, and ended, if it were true, fear Othello's dagger. Josephine simply laughed and said in her inimitable Creole accent, "Kiffiesti drôle, Bonaparte. He's so amusing." Napoleon stayed in Milan until May, waiting for the peace with Piedmont to be confirmed, but no sooner did he move east once more against Beaulieu than Milan and Pavia rose in revolt. This was the worst possible news, as it seemed to mean that every time Napoleon conquered a territory in Italy, he would have to detach part of his army to hold it in subjection. A stern lesson was called for. He invested Pavia and bloodily retook the town, giving it over to sanguinary plunder by his troops as punishment. His first draconian instinct, to put to death the entire 300-strong garrison, was overcome only in favor of savage looting in terram. After dealing with Pavia, Napoleon won another victory at Borghetto on the 30th of May, which involved his setting foot on the territories of the Venetian Republic. But the message of Pavia had got through to the burghers of Milan. When Napoleon turned back to besiege the city, the Milanese sent envoys at once to tender their submission. Napoleon next proceeded to the siege of Mantua, which opened on the 4th of June. Just before returning to Milan, Napoleon was at the village of Vallejo, and was nearly taken prisoner by an Austrian scouting party. He had to bolt over several garden walls wearing only one boot. This taught Napoleon the lesson that he needed a bodyguard, and from this incident date the Guides, an elite corps or Praetorian Guard, later to be greatly expanded in numbers to form the Imperial Guard. But at least by the beginning of June he could tell himself that he controlled the entire Lombardy plain except the fortress of Mantua. Returning to Milan on the 7th of June, he was bitterly disappointed not to find Josephine waiting for him. Instead, there was a scrap of a letter in which she claimed she was ill, with 3 doctors in attendance. In despair he wrote to her that 1,000 daggers were tearing at his heart. My emotions are never moderate, and since the moment I read that letter I have been in an indescribable state. The ardent love which fills me has perhaps unbalanced my mind. To Joseph he wrote, "You know that Josephine is the first woman I have ever adored. I love her to distraction and I cannot remain any longer without her." By now he had heard from Murat and did not like what he heard. Always a superstitious man, Napoleon was deeply troubled by the apparent coincidence that on the very day Murat arrived in Paris, the glass broke on the miniature of Josephine he carried on his person. According to Marmont, he went pale when the glass broke and said, "Marmont, either my wife is very ill or she is unfaithful." Receiving no further word from Josephine and unable to work out what was detaining her in Paris, Napoleon decided to put his private woes before the Directory. On June he wrote to Barras, "I hate all women. I am in despair. My wife has not arrived. She must be detained by some lover in Paris." 4 days later he wrote to Josephine, "Without appetite or sleep, without interest or friendship, no thought for glory or fatherland, just you. The rest of the world has no more meaning for me than if it had been annihilated." The hatred for women he acknowledged to Barras found expression in one of his few peevish letters to Josephine, in which he accused her of loving everyone more than her husband, including the dog Fortune. In the latter assessment of the feather-headed Josephine's cynophilia he was certainly correct. Napoleon followed his broadside to Barras by an explicit statement to Josephine that, since she was ill, He would return to Paris within 5 days, becoming more and more fearful that the distraught Napoleon might really return to Paris to fetch his wife himself, bringing the ever-victorious army with him, possibly for a final settling of political accounts. The 5 men of the Directory exerted maximum pressure on Josephine to join her husband. Carnot concocted a ludicrous letter claiming that the Directory had kept Josephine in Paris, lest her presence distract Bonaparte from his victories, but that, now he held Milan, there could be no further objection. There is an element of farce in the way the Directory colluded with Josephine to conceal her infidelity. The dalliances of women have often threatened to shake regimes, but surely seldom in such an indirect, convoluted and comical way as this. According to contemporary witnesses, the directors virtually had to bundle a sobbing Josephine onto the Milan-bound carriage. Her friend Antoine Arnault noted, she wept as though she were going to a torture chamber instead of Italy to reign as a sovereign. A bizarre 6-carriage convoy wound its way south. In the first of them sat Josephine with the dreaded pug Fortune, together with Junot, Joseph and Hippolyte Charles. Joseph had spent his time in Paris in the corridors of power, making new friends among the powerful, lobbying for an ambassadorship and extending his impressive portfolio of real estate investments in the environs of Paris. Charles was returning to his post as aide-de-camp to Colonel Victor Emmanuel Leclerc, another of Bonaparte's Toulon finds, who repaid Napoleon's patronage by seducing the beautiful Pauline. Josephine went out of her way to make the journey south as protracted as possible. At night she and Charles would contrive to end up in the same bedroom. Joseph, egomaniacal as ever, and reportedly suffering from gonorrhea after an encounter in Paris, worked on a new novel. Only the faithful Junot properly consulted Napoleon's interests, but Josephine solved that problem by flirting outrageously with him, often in front of Charles, to the cynical amusement of that most depraved hussar. After an 18-day journey, during which she and Charles had made love several times each day, Josephine and entourage arrived in Milan early in July, to Napoleon's great relief. His letters to Anne about his wife had previously been full of suicidal despair. In Milan, Napoleon was installed in the glittering and gorgeous Palazzo Serbelloni. For 48 hours he slaked the pent-up passions of the past 4 months. Junot told him about the liaison with Charles and was surprised to find that his chief, instead of having Charles shot on the spot, allowed him to depart for Brescia on his official duties. Only later did he cashier him and send him packing back to Paris. Here is yet one more piece of circumstantial evidence that, consciously or unconsciously, Napoleon actually liked the fact that Josephine was habitually unfaithful. What he hated was overt evidence of the fact, which would bring him into ridicule and contempt as a cuckolded husband. Having set his mind at rest about Josephine, Napoleon could now turn to urgent military matters. On paper his position was good, since only the fortress of Mantua held out against him, but his situation was fraught with potential peril. Already the Austrians were switching reinforcements to the Austrian front to start a counter-offensive, and lines of communication were too long, with hostile and disgruntled cities on their flanks. Napoleon saw clearly enough that his chief problem was going to be that of taking Mantua while the Austrians were trying to relieve it, even while diverting significant parts of his own army to keep control of conquered territory. He became impatient when no word was received from Morau and Jourdan on the other fronts. Unless they took the offensive soon, Austria could pour troops into Italy. On the 8th of June he had written testily to General Henry Clark in the Topographical Bureau in Paris, "I see only one way of avoiding being beaten in the autumn, that is to arrange matters so that we are not obliged to march into the south of Italy. According to all the information reaching us, the Emperor is sending many troops to his Italian army. We wait impatiently for news from the Rhine." Under pressure from the Directory to lay hands on the wealth of Florence, Rome and Naples, Napoleon decided to risk a quick southern expedition before bringing the siege of Mantua to a conclusion. He sent 2 divisions south to occupy Bologna, Ferrara and Tuscany. Augereau defeated the forces of the papacy near Bologna, and negotiations opened with Pius VI. Napoleon played a double game, writing fiery philippics about the infamy of priestcraft to the Directory, while writing secretly to Cardinal Mattei about his great reverence for the Holy Father. The Pope soon signed an armistice, conceding the occupation of Ancona and agreeing to pay a huge indemnity, including art treasures to be taken from the Vatican galleries. Faced with this defection, Tuscany surrendered, Florence and Ferrara opened their gates, and the French occupied Leghorn, thus denying the Royal Navy a valuable base. Napoleon's life after Josephine's arrival was schizoid, divided as it was between quickly snatched meetings with his wife in Milan and urgent rushing to a political or military flashpoint. Just before she arrived he had visited Tortona, Piacenza, Parma, Reggio and Modena. Later he was in Bologna and was lionized by the Grand Duke in Florence.